Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you for another Retail Profit AMA. Today, we're going to be discussing how to execute experiences with a very, very special guest, which we will introduce shortly. Now, my name is Riley Stevens. I'm the Director of Insights here at Retail Profit, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's discussion. I want to just cover off a few housekeeping items, and then, as I said, we'll introduce our host, Doug Stevens, and our very special guest. So, first things first. Today's discussion will be an hour in length, so we're going to be finishing up here at 12 on the dot. And as always, many of you have attended previous sessions with us, so you'll know that we will not be looking at the chat box or any raised hands. If you have a question, we would love to hear them, but use the chat box, and that's just located at the bottom of your screen. We'll be looking at the chat box, or sorry, at the Q&A box, I should say, throughout the discussion and answering your questions live today. Now, keep in mind, we're going to be trying to get to as many as possible, but we encourage you to also, if you have follow-up questions after the discussion, or just simply want to share your thoughts on what we're discussing today, we encourage you to use the hashtag RetailProfitAMA on social media. I've also included our usernames here for you to tag us if you'd like. Now for introductions. Doug Stevens is the founder and CEO of Retail Profit, and he will be the host for today's discussion. Doug is currently in the midst of writing his third and highly anticipated book, Resurrecting Retail, The Future of Business in a Post-Pandemic World. Now, very exciting news, Resurrecting Retail is now currently available for pre-order. So if you'd like to check it out on Amazon, we encourage you all to do that today. Now I will throw to Doug to introduce our very special guest.
Thank you, Riley, and thank you for that shameless plug of the book. That's what family is for, and I appreciate it. Hey, everyone, how are you? It's good to see you. Again, we've got an amazing turnout for today's event, and it's no wonder the guest really requires no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. Rachel Shechtman is the founder of Story New York City, and I guess it was around 2011 or 2012, I became aware of this thing called Story. And I happened to be writing a book at the time, so I was deep into research, and so made my pilgrimage to New York City and visited Rachel's store on 10th Avenue on the west side of New York. And it was like, as soon as I walked in and looked around, I just thought, okay, yeah, this is where it's going. Retail is about storytelling, and this is the way stories should be told. And it was a really pioneering concept and a daring concept at the outset. So from that point on, Rachel and I have talked over the years. We've become friends, and every now and then we check in with each other on where all of this is headed. So with that, absolutely delighted to have Rachel with us today. Thanks for being here, Rachel.
Thank you for having me.
Now, maybe the place to start is we throw the words experiential retail around a lot. But my sense, and I'm not sure if you feel the same way, is that oftentimes you can be talking to someone about experiential retail and you're not quite sure if you're both talking about the same thing. So what is it? What is this thing we call experiential retail?
Yeah, I think, well, thank you again to Riley and Doug for having me. It is fun. And I do remember when you walked in the store shortly after we opened, and here we are in this new normal, short-term normal, hopefully. But I think, I don't know. I was thinking about this before, we pressed the start button. Is there one universal definition that applies? I don't know that I feel strongly one way or another. I think for me, at least, when I think about starting Story, and I just think about retail in general, the way I kind of think about it is a multi-sensory experience, right? So it's funny, for the fun of it, I Googled the definition of experiential retail, right? And there's words like VR and art and screens. I don't know that I believe you could have those things and have it not be experiential. It's all in the execution. For me, we kind of had this little invisible formula that was about a multi-sensory experience that combined auditory, visual, and visceral elements. And so, and where that derived from was people learn and communicate differently, right? I'm a very visual learner. My sister's very auditory. If a store doesn't communicate to both of us, only one of us is leaving there with an impression or an experience, right? I mean, you've heard me say before, you know, we always talked about experience per square foot, and we always made sure that there were those 3 multisensory elements throughout a story. And depending on the story we were telling, if it was beauty story, we might have dialed up the visceral experience, where if it was home for the holidays, people want in and out, so that might be more visual and auditory. So we always thought about it in terms of those 3 senses is kind of how we looked at it.
I think it's interesting what you say about screens, because I think that it for a while anyway, there was sort of this default to believing that that's what it meant. Oh, we were going to have a retail experience. So yeah, it was always like some little VR installation over in a corner somewhere, or it was just basically taking web information and driving it to screens in store. It seemed to me that it really was, I mean, it was almost more about the art than the science, right? I mean, the technology pieces could be aspects of right, allowing the experience to take shape, but it was really more of an artistic process. Can you just sort of, for people listening to this, and I suspect there are a lot of people who are facing the challenge of mounting these kinds of experiences, whether they're online or off, can you just walk people through the process that the team at Story would go through in creating a new theme or story?
Yeah.
Or was there a process? Or was it just chaos?
Well, the joke is, the tagline I always say is, you know, both my life and the process was chaotic continuity. Right. I was just talking about one of my oldest employees who I still talk to every week yesterday about it. You know, some stories we were crazy enough to pull off in 3 weeks. Others we had, you know, the luxurious runway of a whopping 3 months. Which is still aggressive to some people. But, you know, I think the process was like, we would sit in a room and it was primarily Megan and I, my right arm, and say like, what would we get excited about? But we had certain rules and words. So it had to be, you know, versatile in appeal and engaging. So we would never say yes to a theme, for example, like bridal story, right? Because we always said we want an experience that's relevant for men, women, and kids between 5 to 95. Now, granted, not all age demographics, whatnot, is going to have a similar experience. But in doing so, you know, it's hard for me to imagine getting a 6-year-old like really pumped about a bridal theme, right? But, you know, if, you know, we did his story that was with Details magazine, we brought in Tom's shoes and we had shoes for kids, and we found cool businesses that would appeal to younger demographics. So for us, it was really those 2 words, versatile and engaging. They might sound generic, but for us, that was kind of the litmus test for a narrative. And then in terms of the process of how we brought it to life, you know, merchandising, we had 2 different kind of narrative storytelling tools, merchandising and event programming. And so the merchants would go out and find products and entrepreneurs that exemplified whatever that broader narrative was. And then we had amazing, you know, we did over that, you know, I don't know how many thousands of events over the years, community centric programming that would dial into that as well. So kind of our editorial side was merchandise and event programming. And then the last bit of it that like I am very passionate about is the training piece. We were, you know, we call our sales staff storytellers, and they would train each other. So we had peer-to-peer training, and then we had vendor training. And depending on the price point and the complexity of the merchandise, that would dictate what was peer-to-peer versus what was vendor training.
And your revenue model, for those that don't know, what was that comprised of?
Yeah, so we had two revenue streams. So like a traditional retail, we sold merchandise, but we also had a second revenue stream, which was sponsorship. And so the hypothesis kind of, for me, story was an experiment. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if anyone would come. And the hypothesis was, could retail be a media channel? And how can we look at retail and monetizing differently? And so, by, story, the original New York location, by the time, all was said and done, an average sponsorship was 600,000, holiday was $1 million. And we had very specific, to some degree, I wonder if I should call it sponsorship, because it was almost like we were, a consulting firm with a retail arm. We were like a living lab because we had very specific deliverables. But yeah, that was our second revenue stream.
So Rachel, I find that really interesting, and I want to sort of dig into this a little bit more for our audience. This role reversal of the physical store acting more like a media channel was something that when Story was created was really one of the first of its kind, and it really did flip the script on what it meant to be a physical retail store. And I know that you once said that media can occur anywhere where people gather in numbers. Can you explain that thinking to our audience, and then elaborate on how that philosophy shifts the role of the physical store?
Sure. Well, I think, I kind of had this thought way back when I started, when I had read, this is a 2018 statistic, so I don't know the most recent numbers, but, Starbucks, back when we could go into Starbucks, but Starbucks had 60 million people a week going into its stores worldwide, right? A week. So that's what, 24 million a month? And that's in 2018. And you go think of what we define as traditional media channels, right? And you look at magazines and newspapers, and this isn't to diminish that at all. So this isn't an or, it's an and, right? So I'm not comparing in that regard, but more just like if we're paying to create campaigns and impressions, in these other forms of media, why aren't we, there's all this untapped media out there. I mean, you go do a strategic partnership with Starbucks and get your brand in front of those 60 million people a week, that doesn't even count for whatever social media or earned media comes as a byproduct for that. That trumps many, many other forms of traditional media tenfold. So for me, I just think there's such an opportunity to reimagine how brands partner and where they show up. And, I think sales per square foot, I've said this, it's not an original statement, sales per square foot, I think is an insanely archaic metric. And I think that, there's just untapped potential to really think differently about engagement and monetization.
You said something one time, Rachel, that I've misappropriated and used myself many times now. That is that rent is the new cost of customer acquisition. We've always looked at media as being the construct through which we develop awareness and we develop, the ability to push consumers to retail, and retail is just the distribution arm. But you framed it up that way. Rent is the new cost of customer acquisition. I suppose that's more important now than ever, given the escalating cost of digital media, right? I mean, we're hearing stories now of brands that are basically saying they're tapping out. They're saying, okay, there's no way I can even justify acquiring customers on Facebook anymore. It's just way too expensive. Or, if it's not Facebook, it's Instagram. So do you see that role of the store as a media channel being perhaps even more profound coming out of this crisis, or in the midst of it, maybe?
Yeah, I think that there's some brands adapting more and more, I think, to this philosophy, looking at it that way. And I think that, again, if I set up a store and I get 50 new customers in a door that day, right? Why the heck am I not running that math with the same math that I do paying for Google AdWords? Like, I just don't, the logic doesn't make sense, right? And everything's so siloed and segmented, and everyone has their own math per their silo. But I just think that it's a very important way to think about it. And I think, there's more and more kind of developers and models out there. I was just, I'm out in Colorado now, and I was down in Denver, and there's a great place called Free Market within the dairy block. And you see brands there like Beauty Counter, and, there's D2C brands there. Then you have small independent brands. But I was so blown away and impressed by it. They're doing, percentage of sales for rent. So it's a lot easier for people to test and try shorter term leases. And so I think the more and more we find landlords and developers rethinking their own models, that becomes a forcing mechanism for other brands to rethink their cost structure, I think.
I think that's a good point. And it's something that I've brought up with people in the shopping center industry a lot, is that, look, if we assume a future where fewer items are being purchased in stores, just purely as a factor of consumers, availing themselves of online convenience, it's reasonable to assume that the stores that occupy a shopping center somewhere are going to see lower and lower sales each year. How do you continue to just raise rents or charge percent rent over and above a certain threshold if sales are going down? And so if the role of that store is increasingly to be that of a media property, would it not make sense for the shopping center to look at themselves as being a network of media properties, right? And their role, just like any network, is to drive people to that center so that they can be exposed to those brand impressions. And it really starts to look an awful lot like a TV network.
Exactly.
When you start to run it with that philosophy.
Yeah, I think you take it a step further. One thing that I don't even know if you know this story, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, a lot of people don't know that before I launched Story, it was a startup store. Did you know this? So
no.
Ben Kaufman, who founded Camp and is my bestie, he bet me like $20,000 in sponsorship money, which back then was a lot, that I couldn't, I signed my lease that I couldn't open the store for Christmas. I had signed it on October 28th, 2011. I was like, no, I'll be open for Christmas. And then I was like, crap, I don't have merchandise. I don't have my trademark. And so I was at home, and there might've been a glass of wine or two involved. And I was like, wait a minute. Like, if we're the same people who live offline, who live online, why can't we have beta? Why can't I open a store in beta? And so, and for those listening, beta being, that form in which many digital and technology companies launch, and it's their way of saying, hey, we're just testing things out so things might break or be wrong. And so I'm like, okay, so we called ourselves a startup store beta, and we only sold merchandise from startups. And this was in 2011. So this was before D2C brands had retail stores. So we had Birchbox, and we had Bobble Bar and Quirky and Art Space. And I use that as an example. I mean, we had 2 employees at the time. Fast Company wrote an article on a startup store. I had no idea what I was doing. But I use that as an example because what was fascinating was overnight, right? It had millions and millions of media impressions, and the response was insane. And what I realized was, Birchbox, Bobble Bar, Quirky, none of them were competitive with each other. And they all shared, a psychographic of consumer. So all of these brands were so excited to share with their communities, hey, we have a physical space. So guess what? Like, Quirky acquired new customers from Birchbox, messaging its community. But it was all copacetic because they were all, it wasn't like another beauty company. So I agree with you. I think really looking at these formats and combining of different brands and retails as media is a no-brainer.
Yeah, agreed. Do we have anything coming in, Riley, in terms of live questions for Rachel?
We have lots of live questions. Quickly, I want to just ask Rachel, this is a question that's come up regarding camp experience stores. And it's all about this notion of, we touched a little bit on it, but how the pandemic is now changing this experience that's happening at store level. So Rachel, you sit on the board of Camp. You mentioned camp experience stores and your relationship with Ben. Can you tell us, I guess, first of all, let's for our audience who maybe haven't visited a camp store, tell us what camp is. And then I'm also curious to hear how you're advising brands to handle the disruption caused by COVID-19. You know, Camp, which is a company that's so reliant on the physical interactions that take place in the store. How do they come out of this alive and well and thriving?
Yeah, so for those who haven't been Camp or don't know Camp, it's camp.com. So Camp is a family experience store. You basically walk into this 1,200 square foot beautiful, wood gift canteen. And then there's a secret magical speakeasy door that opens to 8,000 square feet of experiential retail. It's thematic, so it changes. They've done cooking camp and they've done travel camp. And so, you know, I really have to say I'm obviously biased for a myriad of reasons, but hats off to Ben and Nikki and their team at Camp, because they were very, very quick to really react to changing circumstances. So some of the things that they've done that they did early on was, you know, I think within days of quarantine kicking in New York and elsewhere, they started doing virtual birthday parties. So I think a lot of the things Doug is talking about in terms of media in a physical world, you know, Ben was really saying, hey, like, let's do media, you know, in a digital world, but also experiential. So they would do virtual birthday parties. I think they did over 10,000 kids had virtual birthday parties around the world. They were free every day at 4 o'clock, or you could pay for a private one, but they were experiential in their own right? So they had clowns and musicians, and they'd say, blow on the screen, and then coins would come at the clown's face, right? And so, you know, yes, it's a little different than being physically with a clown, but it's more than just sitting there and watching a video. And then what happened was they got sponsorship and ad dollars for it. So brands like Apple TV and Ally Bank started paying money to sponsor the birthday parties. Other examples of how they reacted was they created a digital camp and they partnered with Walmart. So, you know, they got sponsorship from Walmart and distribution, you know, through that. They have some vans going around the country doing craft workshops and stuff outside. So I think I can't reveal what's in store for holiday, but I will say what's interesting, right? So all stores are now open. In cases like Dallas, you know, you can go to the experiential part of the store, you know, in an adjusted way, where it's obviously very limited and whatnot. But they just launched a new theme last week in the Norwalk Mall, which is Art Camp, which is a lot of fun. So I think he's being very sensitive to markets. Like the experiential component is not open in New York City. And so depending on the market, depending on what the guidelines are, depending on the design of the space, he's doing what makes sense and continuing to cook up some interesting partnerships.
Rachel, do you think that there is, I mean, as you described that, and I spoke to Ben as well for the Business of Fashion podcast, which all of you are in and will be coming up soon. But when I spoke to Ben, he mentioned that. He said, you know, we had to make this pivot to digital. We knew that we had a lot of kids having birthdays. We sort of took that proposition to Walmart because they have audience, and everything just sort of gelled. When you get into the mindset of being an experiential retailer, does it, do you think, give you that freedom of thought that I'm not anchored to any particular category, I'm not anchored to the sale of any particular product? As an experiential retailer, it seems like what you really are selling is ideas and stories, right? And it seems to me that there's sort of a built-in resilience there to crisis, in the sense that you can make those pivots. Do you agree that you just sort of get a bigger plate? What is it? The sandbox. Do you get a bigger sandbox when you start thinking experientially?
Yes and no. And what I mean by that is I think it really depends on the brand and the category. Because I think that, you know, in the case of Ben, it made sense for him to do virtual birthday parties. Does it make sense for Showfields to do virtual birthday parties? Probably not. you know, it's kind of like, where do you have permission? Where is there authority and authenticity to say, I'm going to be able to monetize based on experience and engage my customer and gain loyalty because of experience? And so I think that, you know, it really depends on how a brand, you know, what their revenue streams are and how they're able to monetize that. So I think that I don't necessarily say that believe that every experiential retailer has built-in resilience. I think it takes ingenuity. And, you know, the other thing is, when you look at something like camp, right, it's a different skill set and talent pool to build digital experiential media than physical experiential media, right? So there's lots of layers, I think, that come along with that. And it also, to some degree, right, is an education and a learning curve with the customer. I mean, in this case, we had a global pandemic that forced us all to be attentive and more adaptive to digital experiences. But the camp customer was used to walking into a store, not sitting in front of a screen. And it's great that we've seen that evolve. But yeah, I think it really depends on the category and the team and whatnot.
Fair enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Rachel, we've got a live question for you here. And this question comes from Shannon Ryan. And he says, and I quote, Rachel, #big fan. That's the first part. And he would like to know and hear your take on the future of big flagship stores. So this is something that we've touched on a little bit in past episodes of this live stream. And Shannon's point here is that, as you know, companies like Under Armour, for example, are now pulling the plug on these massive experiential retail concepts in New York City. So his question is, are these smaller, more nimble approaches the future? And is this idea of thinking big simply over now?
I don't know. I think we need a psychic or a futurist for this one. I don't think it's over. I think it's going to take us a little while to get back there. You know, I don't think it's over. I think that, you know, people are going to rethink the function of a flagship and what those experiences are and how much you have to touch things or not. I don't think they're over. I feel like I'm letting Shannon down without a sexier, more extensive answer, but I just don't. I think in general, like right now, unfortunately, there's so much that's unknown. And, you know, I think the tendency of many brands is everyone's in survival mode and thinking about, how do I get through this, as opposed to, how am I going to thrive and excel and be relevant, you know, a decade from now. And so I think everyone's still in that survival mindset. And what are we going to do based on what we know and the realities now? And there is a very low tolerance for risk taking, especially from public companies. And so, you know, anyways, I don't think that that's much of an answer, but I will say I'm not giving up on big flagships. I just think that it's going to take a little time it will definitely take time for them to come back. And it's also, I think there's going to be new and I really hope there's new and exciting expressions of what a flagship is in the future. I just think now is not the time, you know, where people are cooking up those visions, unfortunately.
I'll jump on that a little bit. I guess I take a slightly different view from Rachel, in the sense that oftentimes I will hear, you know, a client will call or they'll get in touch and they'll say, we're developing a new concept. We're developing a concept store. And then you get together and you talk it through with them, only to realize that what they really mean is it's a flagship store. Yeah, we want to build a flagship store. And there's always this pang of disappointment when I hear that, because I feel like the whole idea of a flagship store sort of throws up a lot of problems sometimes in organizations. One being that, you know, oftentimes the operations side of the business, the store ops side, sort of looks at these things as being marketing extravagances. They don't feel that they're real stores. So, you know, we don't take ownership of what goes on in them to any great extent. And then you have marketing sort of blaming store operations that customer experience in the flagships isn't where it's supposed to be. You have the C level basically looking at the flagship store and measuring it on nothing but traditional metrics. So they're not even accounting for any sort of media value, to Rachel's earlier point. And it sort of always has confused me why you would want to build a few stores in the world that make the rest of your stores look really shitty by comparison. Why would you do that? So I sort of look at it the other way, and I would like to believe that that brands are constantly rolling out concepts, new concepts. They're tweaking things. They're iterating. They're developing. But every store, in that sense, is a flagship. No matter where I shop in the world with a particular brand, you know, I'm walking in and I'm getting what I think is the unfiltered brand story and experience. So maybe I'm a little jaded or tainted, just been, you know, sort of disappointed too many times. But when somebody just says, look, this is like Project X, Skunk Works, off the beaten path, and we're trying a new concept, that's where I get really excited.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Love it. So, Rachel, I know that at one point you had spoken to Doug about this idea of what you called the cocktail party test to determine how a brand is doing relative to experience. Do you mind explaining this concept? And then, Doug, I'd love to hear your thoughts on when you first heard Rachel say this and how you think this relates to what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, prior to Story, I was a consultant for 10 years. And one of the exercises I would do with different clients and teams is the cocktail party test. So the cocktail party test is walk in and out of a store. And when you come out of the store, describe it as a person you met at a cocktail party. So what I mean by that is I might say, well, she was energetic and fun and really interesting and well-traveled and had really great stories to tell. She'd be really fun to invite to a dinner party. Now that might be what Lululemon said to me. And by said to me, I mean the combination of interaction with salespeople, what's the store smell like, look like, what was the music in the background, what are all these subconscious things that give us an emotional reaction, right? I'll probably get in hot water for saying this, but like, you know, I might say, you know, well, she was nice. But she was like, you know, a little apathetic and indifferent and didn't have that much of a point of view. Like she wasn't offensive, but I wouldn't, you know, go out of my way to hang out with her again. And that might be the Gap. Like, I like the Gap. I just went there last week, right? Like I needed something. I knew the Gap would have a t-shirt. I got my t-shirt, but I wasn't, you know, and to be fair, right? Different people and different brands serve different functions in our lives. So they don't all need to be, you know, ecstatic and dinner party guests. But for me, it's when you walk out of a store, if you were to describe it to a friend or to someone else using adjectives typically associated with a person, what would those be? And that's usually a healthy indicator of whether or not you'll go back to that store again.
It's an interesting, it's so, it's deceivingly simple as a test, but it's really, really relevant. And when Rachel and I were talking about that, it really made me think, you know, we've always sort of defined positioning, you know, in terms of, am I luxury, am I discount? And more recently, it's sort of been, am I convenience-based or am I experientially based? You know, we've sort of tried to triangulate the position of a brand in a market along these kinds of spectrums. But it seemed to me, and that's when I heard Rachel say that, it sort of ignited this thought that this idea of a retail persona, where a consumer walks in and immediately, within a few seconds, immediately sort of understands who you are as a retailer. What is the function that you that you fulfill for that person? Are you a tastemaker brand? Are you a storytelling brand? Are you an artist brand that creates these magical camp experiences? Are you an engineering brand that focuses on product, like product and precision and engineering prowess? That's your strength. So coming out of that, I was like, my head was ignited. You know, I was like, okay, so there are these archetypes that will survive in the future of retail because they provide this clear purpose. And it sort of sparked for me the idea that purpose, the purpose you fulfill in a consumer's life, is the new positioning. And if your answer to Rachel's question, like, what would I think if I met you at a cocktail party, is, yeah, it's all right. Yeah, you're done. You have to fix that problem. It doesn't matter, like big data doesn't matter. The use of AI doesn't matter. Hiring the right people doesn't matter. If you don't have a purpose in a consumer's life, you're finished, and you've got to fix that problem. So I think it's just a brilliant way to sort of put your brand under the microscope.
So it sounds to me like, when I'm hearing Rachel, you and Doug, you describe all of these elements that contribute to that feeling that you get when you walk away. You know, obviously so much of it is what you see, what you hear, what you can touch. But another really big missing piece, and I think a huge piece of this, is really how these experiences are delivered by the people that are serving them in store. So, you know, camp, I've been in the camp store, a couple of camp stores in New York City as well, and had incredible experiences, and been, you know, they call their staff camp counselors. And Rachel, you mentioned that you used to call your associates storytellers. And I love that really strong point of view as what purpose those people in store provide to the people that are coming in, and the people that they're interacting with. Would you say that this is one of the most important pieces? And if to further that, I'm really curious to understand, where does it fall down? What are the elements that, if they're missing, can create you know, the opposite effect, and really leave maybe a bad taste in someone's mouth? Because for me, in my thinking, hearing you guys go through that, I would assume it would be store associates, but explain that a little bit, where you think people fall down.
I mean, for me, you know, I would always, as a kid, you know, I'm 4 generations of retail, and my mom was always obsessed with customer service, and she'd always give feedback when we were younger in stores, sometimes constructive, sometimes not. And, you know, I'd always like roll my eyes or be embarrassed. And I'm like, Mom, it's no big deal. But you know what? Like, she's so right. It is the biggest deal. And I think, like, I don't care how many screens you have in a store, or VR or AR or video games. Like, if you can't provide badass customer service, forget about it. Like, just don't bother. Don't have a store, is what I would say. Is like, you are in that business, and you are in that business now more than ever, in my opinion. And this is not the, you know, sexiest new technology or whatever bells and whistles, but I just, like, I'm passionate about this. I'm obsessive about it. There's a store I went to recently in Santa Fe on a little road trip called Santa Fe Dry Goods. I got a handwritten letter after I was there. You know, I bought a few things, nothing that was going to materially impact their business. And that was just so awesome. Like, oh, a handwritten letter? Like, but I just think, you know, it's interesting, just picking up on what Doug was saying before, that I really like how he synthesized and articulated about persona and purpose coming together. Is, you know, we think about discovery as it relates to product, right? And experience. And I think on the persona piece, what part of the litmus test is also distinctive. You know, what is it that my people are, you know, sharing, or what message are they sending that's distinctive, right? What Ben's energy is with his camp counselors is one, and what ours is with storytellers is another. And so it's kind of like, if people are your product, what is it? How are you going to make sure that their interaction, their language, their value proposition is distinctive and memorable? And I would, you know, I would take it a step further. We even did that with our vendor community. So we went back to the source, and, you know, there's this amazing woman, Christina, who worked on my team, who is our vendor relations manager. We handwrite thank you notes to all the vendors we work with, thanking them for supplying us with products and stuff like that. So I just think it's like a back to basics and the importance to relationships. And now I'm just rambling, so I'll let Doug chime in.
You know, we were talking before we got on the broadcast today about just sort of the evolving landscape. And it seems to me, and I mean, this is sort of, insight hiding in plain sight, I suppose. But brands like Alibaba, Walmart, JD.com, Amazon, who could forget Amazon? I mean, these guys are going to just be on a new level of enormity when we come out of this crisis. And they're going to be more pervasive in the lives of consumers. Their marketplaces will have expanded. Amazon just announced it's going into luxury yesterday. They're tenacious. They're definitely going to make inroads. But what they're going to do is they're going to force a lot of large national retailers to become mini marketplaces. So Target and Kroger and these brands are going to realize that these apex predators now are an existential threat. And oh shit, we got to open a marketplace to compete. And that basically puts every other retailer in the world into a position where they become a specialty retailer. They're not a global marketplace. They're not a national marketplace. So guess what? You're a specialty retailer. Oh, and by the way, guess what? You're experiential too, because your consumer is going to demand it. I mean, unless you're a dollar store, and who knows even how long dollar stores are going to be around if Amazon has its way, but everyone else is a specialty retailer. So to Rachel's point, it's almost a non-starter. If you're not delivering a level of differentiated customer service, it's a non-starter. You've already lost, or unless, perhaps you're Costco and you design your experience so that it is very low touch, but it's still an awesome experience and people enjoy it, that's fine. But you've got to provide that basic level of satisfaction. Otherwise, and it really, to Rachel's other point, I believe that you can put all the screens and bells and whistles and technology into a store, but if people in the store are not ready to support that with great customer interactions, then it all falls apart. And, interestingly too about Ben Kaufman is that with camp, I mean, Ben's taking advantage of the resident community of actors and theater people in New York. He's capitalizing on that pool of talent, literally, to power these experiences. So it's not just somebody who's willing to work weekends and nights and doesn't mind, starving on a retail salary. These are people who are bringing real skills to the game.
Yep, I agree.
Now, on that, Doug, you mentioned the bells and whistles and technology, and the whole conversation we've been talking about all of these various elements that contribute to this experience. Jeffrey asks, how much is too much? So many stores are defaulting when they think of experience, they think of loading in as much stuff as they can within the four walls. And, Jeffrey references here that there's brain studies that have proven that we can only really remember so much at one time. And I think this is an interesting point, and it's probably important to differentiate that what I'm gathering is that the message here is not necessarily to just load in as much shit as you can to the four walls, but really to, Rachel, you mentioned before, authenticity, and how can we create experiences that are authentic? Am I correct in assuming that we're not just talking about loading in as much as we can? And if so, how do we go about thinking through how to create thoughtful experiences and not just any experience will do?
I mean, I have a pretty short answer to that. So I would say, to me, it was never about filling a quota. Okay, we need 10 experiences. We need this, we need that. Whenever we look at an element, integrating an experiential element in store, we ask one very simple question. Am I giving the customer an experience they can't get on their couch? An iPad with a website on it or an iPad with a video on it, unless it is original content that it is adding value to whatever it is that you're showing in that split second, and it's short and it's sweet, is not that. And so for me, it's like, if you can do it at home, then don't do it in the store. So it's not a long answer, but I think it's just, that's a very easy way to saying, are you creating something that someone isn't going to get outside of your four walls? And that will create an emotional experience.
I agree. And this is part of my gripe with flagship stores. All of a sudden you go and you commit to, 40,000 square feet on the Champs-Élysées, and guess what? You have to fill that space. And oftentimes it's filled with, novelties and sideshows that aren't relevant to the consumer's experience. It's interesting, when I was sitting down and sort of thinking about this whole notion of experiences for the book, I thought about this issue of size that we sometimes, and I think this is part of the knock on experiential retail, is that we assume that it's massive, it's expensive, etc. But, I was sort of comparing it to cuisine. And, when we go and we have a really, really great, Michelin star meal, oftentimes you get these tiny, tiny little portions. And our inclination is to think that, oh, they're serving me small portions so that they can just make more money, right? But there's actually a physiological reason for small portions. And that is that your taste buds are most excited by the first few bites of something. After that point, it's all just, more of the same. So the first few bites really ignite your senses and ignite the experience. And so it's smaller portions across more courses. That's that sort of thing. And I take the same view of experiences. Some of my most cherished experiences were quite small in size. There were, as Rachel said, it's a gesture sometimes. It's just, wow, that was really a thoughtful gesture and really, kind of sat well with me emotionally. These things don't have to be massive 40,000 square foot circus sideshows. They just have to be meaningful. They have to be relevant, and they have to be, to Rachel's point, something that I cannot experience at home. And I think if you get those three elements correct, you'll be successful, and then just keep changing it up.
Dennis has a follow-up question here. Rachel, this is for you. He's curious to know, when Story launched, did you have an e-commerce site? This is something that I don't know either, and I'd be interested to know.
We didn't. There's early interviews with me where I'm like, oh, we'll have e-commerce by the end of the year in 13 stores or whatever. I had no idea what I was doing. We didn't have it in the beginning just because of I borrowed money from a couple of friends and self-funded the business. And I had no idea what I was doing, period, let alone online, offline. So the plan was always to have e-commerce, but then the store became such a intellectual playground for me. And so every new story, new theme, new partner, new collaborator was, an opportunity to test a different theory or, leverage the store as a living lab. And so I just had so much fun playing and learning about physical. And frankly, there was so much happening on digital that I always said, if we did digital, there had to be a value proposition that was differentiated in the same way our physical experience was differentiated. And I just had too much fun playing in the store and never kind of got around to it. But I'm more curious about it now than ever. But yeah, nope, not in the early days.
And then
Rachel, I have a question for you. Sorry, Riley. I just have a quick question for Rachel. Rachel, you part of your career, you spent time with Macy's. You built market at Macy's. Some really interesting concepts. I just have a question for you. Going back to this notion of size and scope. It's no secret that the department store channel as a channel has been in turbulent waters for the last number of years, perhaps decades. Do you feel, that a department store, an entire department store, could potentially move to a model like Story, where it's combination of product revenue and call it sponsorships or collaborations? And if so, how would you go about it?
Yeah, I think, I'll caveat my comments are my own and not based on my time at Macy's. I think yes, and yes. In terms of that, can you take a department store model and make it based on a media model? Yes. I think there was a question or a comment about, department stores, can they be used as mixed use space? Yes. I mean, to me, I think, there's a renaissance, a new frontier. There's, again, I think it's hard for any public company right now to do anything innovative or risky, but I would say the greatest risk is to not take a risk. Most Harvard Business School case studies will tell you, around innovation in certain junctures, that something similar. But But I think that, in terms of how I would do it, I would start with a blank piece of paper, and I would build a team that's cross-functional and integrated in a mix of talent from different industries. I think your point bringing up camp and them hiring actors is a great example. I think the days of saying, oh, I want to hire someone with 15 years store experience. Well, the customer 15 years ago is not the customer of today. I'd rather the person who's a quick study, who I can train, who's going to create a new script in theater for the customer of today. So I think it's all about looking under the hood of the car. And I think, I'm so grateful for my time at Macy's, and, really what that was all about for me personally was so much about learning. And it was about how you scale new service and training models. How do you onboard small businesses at scale? And so, I would say, how do you build a team differently? So I would start with the nuts and the bolts and the screws, and then get a hammer and a wrench and start building a cross-functional team from different industries. And yeah.
I almost get the sense that it's about sort of, going away from considering your business to be this massive enterprise where you sort of enter into agreements with different vendors, and you sort of operate against these status quo models of wholesale distribution to retail markup, et cetera, et cetera. And it's more just sort of saying, okay, look, what we are is we're a platform. We have space online, we have space in the physical world, we have audience, we have people at our door each morning coming into our space. So we are a platform for experiences to happen. And what we need to do is make it easy for different businesses, different ideas, concepts to plug into our platform, even for a short period of time, and just come to life. Let's make that an easy process. And so we just become, as an organization, this very liquid, flexible platform that can accommodate all kinds of new things at any given time. It just seems so many department stores are just sort of like, they're just tunnel visioned in on, no, it's about margin per square foot. That's all it's about. And that's all it'll ever be about, and yet, a company like Amazon just seems to think of itself as being this amorphous energy that can just do whatever it wants. And I think that's sort of their superpower, but anyway, I guess one day maybe that we will have an experiential department store. Who knows?
Yeah.
So this brings me nicely to a question from Paul that I think it has to be on the minds of others that are listening. Is, okay, it's all fine and dandy to say that we want to include more experiences at retail and to be more critical of the traditional retail metrics. So how the hell do we measure experience? And Doug, I know this is something that we've talked to many clients about, and we often have internal discussions about. And Rachel, I'm sure this is something that was a massive focus for you at Story. So start to talk us through how brands can begin to think about metrics in this new retail age.
I don't think it's a one size fits all answer. I think it really depends on who the brand is and what the objective is. So when we worked with partners at Story, we had one of 4 deliverables that we tracked against. So our KPIs in evaluating the ROI of the sponsorship dollars were either based on earned media and kind of PR marketing. A second was R&D. So like when we worked with Sigma and we did Wellness Story, we had very clear deliverables where they wanted certain insights that they could apply to a project they were working on. So we kind of came out of their R&D budget. Third bucket is licensing. We worked with people like Nickelodeon and Show Mr. Robot, and integrated different licensing partners. And along with that, lots of collaborations. So we tested out new potential licensing partners for people. And then the fourth bucket was using the store as a studio. Is how did we leverage the environment we created, as a studio for people to broadcast, create, and share content. So I I don't think it's as, it's as simple as one answer. And, I think it's just knowing what the deliverable is and tracking against it.
Yeah, in Rachel's world too, I think in the story world, I don't want to assume too much, but in the world of story, you had the added complication of brand partners coming to you and saying, we have, this is our objective, right? And you might have divergent objectives between different brands, P&G versus somebody else, might have completely different objectives. I guess from my standpoint, if I'm, I don't know, if I'm Glossier, let's say, I think it's fair to say, look, I go online and I buy impressions. That's what I do. I buy impressions. I buy the ability to expose consumers to my brand, and there is a market value for those impressions. And I know what it is because there it is. It's on my operating statement. I think it's fair to say that what we need to do is we need to establish what is an in-store impression, all other things being equal, and if it is a positive impression, what is a reasonable value for that relative to other forms of media in the marketplace? Right. And I know it's not an exact science, right? I mean, how much greater is an awesome in-store experience than a really great Facebook ad, if there is such a thing as a great Facebook ad? But what is the offset? I don't know. I don't know what it is, but I think that we have to start making some assumptions about that value, because the problem is if your stores just keep selling less product every year, but you're not accounting for the media value that those stores have in the marketplace and their ability to become customer acquisition vehicles, if you're not accounting for that, then you're just looking at declining P&Ls every year, and you're just lopping off more and more and more of your stores until you simply don't exist. So I think that if you look at it in the final analysis and you say, look, here's our four-wall sales of product. Here are the sales online that we believe that this store is responsible for within its catchment area, or we can reasonably attribute to it. And then finally, we saw 1 million customers last year, and we estimate that each of those customers probably has a market value of $2 if we were to go buy those impressions on the open market. And so the store has just created $4 million in value for us. I think that's a perfectly reasonable assumption, and one that we have to start making,
I agree.
Otherwise, we're just gonna disappear all the retail.
I agree.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes left, and before we close out, I have one more question for both of you. Rapid fire, who do you think is doing this well? If you can just name a few retailers that our audience can maybe look up after, that they've maybe not heard of before, or really anyone, large or small, that you think has left an impression on you personally, or that you know of through your work in the industry.
So specialty retail, I'll say Santa Fe Dry Goods won me over with my last visit. And my answer always is best merchants around is Martin Patrick in Minneapolis. Unbelievable store. Anyone out there, if you haven't been and you're out in that area, it's worth the trip. I'm obviously biased, but I'm very impressed with how Ben has pivoted and evolved his team. And so I think following what Camp is doing is really exciting. As for big stores, I've always been a fan of Selfridges. And so I think I'll also point out that Selfridges is private. So I say that because they can do things that in reality, I just don't think public companies can do. But I think for 20 years, they've been fresh and relevant, and I've always been very impressed with them.
I guess for me, yeah, I agree with Rachel on Selfridges. I think Selfridges is and always from its genesis has been a very theatrical retailer. So they do a great job. But I also like when we were in Tokyo, we visited a bookstore called Bunkitsu, and this is sort of the ultimate test. I love finding stores that are in really desperate channels, in channels that are under siege, but they change the model around and they create a new experience. Bunkitsu is a bookstore that charges you $15 to get in. So right off the top, it's like, wait a minute, there's an admission fee? Yeah, there's an admission, but that gets you the license to sit there all day, read as much as you want. They give you a bottomless cup of coffee. There's a cafe. They merchandise their books completely differently. So they don't organize things in the usual way. They might have all the books that are red, they're going to go over there. All the books that are blue, we'll put them over there. Some books they hide. So you have to find them in the store. You have to crawl through the store to try and find it. I mean, it's just kind of crazy stuff. But then they build in events, there's community, there's media in the space, and it's just a completely different take on the bookstore. So I look at someone like that and I say, you know what, bravo, you know, you're completely rethinking the whole model.
Fantastic. We're at 12 o'clock. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much to Rachel for shedding all of her incredible energy and creativity and insights. You're the best. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. For everyone else too, I'm really interested to know what you want to hear from this live stream series. We are going to be creating more, and this is the last scheduled stream that we currently have. But email me with anything that you think would be a compelling and interesting discussion, any guests that you think would be great for the show. We are all ears and open to hearing it. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in from all around the world, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Rachel.